The courtroom that day carried an unusual energy, one that blended arrogance with curiosity. People had gathered not out of respect but out of a strange eagerness to witness what they assumed would be an ordinary trial, another scene where the system, as it so often did, would treat a decorated soldier like a man stripped of value. When the doors opened and the black army general walked in, heads turned, and whispers began to ripple across the benches. It wasn't admiration they showed, it was a mocking interest, as if the sight of a man in uniform meant little when his skin color betrayed the prejudice already rooted in their minds. The officers in uniform exchanged glances, smirking, their posture leaning into ridicule rather than professionalism. They didn't rise, they didn't shift, they didn't even attempt to disguise the smirk that lingered on their faces. Their body language spoke louder than any words. They believed the man walking through those doors, despite his medals and history, was someone they could belittle without consequence. The judge sat at the high bench, his robe draped across his shoulders with an air of superiority that bordered on arrogance. He didn't have to say a word for the room to understand what he thought of this case, or of the man about to stand before him. His smile, faint but sharp, said enough. It was the smile of someone who felt in control, someone who believed the power of the gavel gave him authority not only over law but over dignity itself. The general, however, walked with calm steps, his boots echoing against the polished wooden floor, a sound that contrasted against the stifled laughter that bounced between the benches. Each sound of his stride was firm, but not aggressive, steady yet unbothered, carrying the quiet discipline of someone who had seen far more than any courtroom could offer. In the gallery, there were those who pretended not to notice the smirks, yet their eyes betrayed them. A woman in the back shook her head, whispering to the man beside her, as if the general's very presence was something to be debated. Another leaned forward with a chuckle, watching closely as if expecting the decorated soldier to falter under the weight of judgment. The officers on the side leaned against the wall, arms crossed, projecting dominance as though the very idea of a black man holding such rank in the U.S. Army was laughable. Their arrogance was not hidden, it was bold, it was loud, and it was designed to strip away the respect that his medals should have commanded. The air was filled with unspoken words, but their faces carried the message clearly: here, your uniform doesn't matter. Here, your service doesn't matter. Here, you are nothing but a defendant, and we are the ones who decide your worth. The arrogance of the room was a performance, a show meant to make one man feel small in the eyes of many. Yet, even as the eyes of mockery followed him, the general did not bend, did not stumble, did not allow his gaze to lower. He carried himself with the composure of someone who had stood on foreign soil with bullets flying past him, who had commanded men in battles where silence was bought with blood. What was arrogance in a courtroom compared to that? But those who sat there that day couldn't see it. They couldn't understand it. They only saw a man they believed they could diminish, and they reveled in the thought. It wasn't just individuals, it was the collective weight of the room pressing against him. The murmur of voices, the snickers, the faint laughter when he adjusted his jacket, the rolling eyes when he stood tall. Every movement he made seemed to invite ridicule, not because of what he did, but because of who he was. The arrogance in that room wasn't quiet. It was intentional, designed to send a message, and for those who participated, it was entertaining. They didn't realize in that moment that the stage they thought they were controlling was about to shift, that arrogance has a short life when it collides with truth. But for now, they leaned into it, enjoying the spectacle of mockery, blind to what stood quietly before them. The dismissive attitude in the courtroom was not subtle, it was painted into every expression, every gesture, and every careless word that floated across the air. The police officer, standing tall in his pressed uniform, carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed authority came not from justice but from arrogance. His eyes narrowed when they fell on the general, not with curiosity or respect, but with a mocking disbelief, as if he could not reconcile the idea that the man before him, this black army general, could ever truly hold the rank and honor his medals proclaimed. His lips curled into a half-smile, the kind reserved not for humor but for contempt, the kind that communicated, without a single word, you don't belong here, and you never will. From the bench, the judge exuded the same energy but wrapped it in layers of formality. He adjusted his robe, shifted in his seat, and looked down at the general as though peering through glass at something foreign. His tone was even, but his eyes carried the weight of dismissal, as though the man standing before him was already guilty, already irrelevant, already reduced to a file on the desk rather than a life of service carved into the nation's history. The judge's small, deliberate pauses when addressing the general dripped with condescension, subtle signals that power in that room belonged only to the bench, not to the man who had spent decades serving under the flag they all claimed to respect. The officer's actions spoke louder than his silence. He leaned against the railing with a casual arrogance, tapping his fingers as though impatient, rolling his shoulders like a man who had no reason to show respect. When the general answered a question, the officer's smirk widened, his eyebrows lifted, and he turned slightly toward his colleagues, as if inviting them into the mockery, as though the words of a decorated soldier were nothing more than a performance to be quietly ridiculed. Every nod he gave was exaggerated, not an acknowledgement, but in a parody of respect, the kind of nod that says I hear you, but I don't value you. The dismissiveness did not stop with gestures, it seeped into the very atmosphere of the trial. Papers shuffled carelessly, pens tapped without rhythm, chairs creaked as bodies shifted with impatience. Each movement was designed to create distraction, to chip away at dignity, to remind the man on the stand that here, in this space, his history was of no consequence. The officer exchanged whispers with another in uniform, their chuckles low but intentional, their eyes darting back at the general like predators circling prey they had already decided could not fight back. The judge's words followed the same pattern. Questions were framed not with curiosity or fairness but with suspicion, a tone that made answers seem like excuses before they were even spoken. He glanced down over his glasses, tilted his head slightly, and let the silence after each response linger long enough to draw a ripple of doubt through the courtroom. It wasn't just what was said, it was how it was framed, the constant undertone that suggested the general was on trial not only for a case but for the audacity of standing as a black man who had risen to power, discipline, and honor. And yet, through every glance and every smirk, the dismissiveness grew into something heavier. It was no longer just an officer mocking or a judge undermining, it was the entire system performing in unison. The air carried the weight of bias disguised as procedure, of arrogance hidden beneath the folds of robes and the shine of badges. Each word from the officer felt designed to remind the courtroom that in his eyes, the general was not a man of service but a man to be stripped of service, not a leader but a defendant, not a figure of strength but a subject of ridicule. The judge's small smirks and carefully measured expressions only reinforced this, as though the two were playing roles in the same theater, each movement choreographed to maintain a hierarchy where respect for the general was impossible. The dismissive attitude was not loud, not explosive, it was quiet, steady, and relentless, the kind of treatment that eats away at dignity by pretending not to see it. The officer's mockery, the judge's condescension, the whispers in the gallery, all of it was part of a carefully woven tapestry of dismissal. And while the general stood in silence, unshaken on the outside, the walls of the courtroom pressed closer with every smirk and every glance, daring him to push back against a system that seemed determined to treat as very the general's presence in that courtroom was unlike anything the others expected. While the room thrived on mockery, whispers, and arrogance, his calm stood out like a mountain against a storm. He did not match their smirks with anger, nor did he bend under their dismissive eyes. Instead, he carried himself with the quiet composure of a man who had faced greater battles than sneers in a courtroom. His uniform sat perfectly against his shoulders, every crease a reflection of discipline, every detail a reminder of the order and precision that had shaped his life. He didn't rush his steps, didn't falter when he met their stares, and didn't let their whispers chip away at his posture. That calm presence was not weakness, it was strength, the kind of strength that comes from knowing who you are and what you represent, even when the world around you tries to strip it away. When the police officer smirked, expecting a reaction, the general gave none. His eyes didn't flinch, his lips didn't tighten, his shoulders didn't shift. He let the silence between them speak louder than any argument could. The officer leaned back in his chair, amused at what he thought was passivity, but what he failed to recognize was the difference between silence born of fear and silence born of control. The general's calm wasn't resignation, it was the restraint of someone who had learned to master emotion, who knew that true power does not always roar, sometimes it stands quietly and forces others to listen. The judge's condescending tone slid across the air like a blade, but it never pierced. The general responded to each question with steady clarity, no tremble in his voice, no hesitation in his words. His answers were sharp but measured, his tone respectful yet firm. He spoke with the cadence of a man who had given orders in war, whose voice had guided soldiers through chaos, whose words had once determined life or death. That same voice now filled the courtroom, not with anger, but with an undeniable authority that no smirk could erase. The calmness wasn't an act, it was the discipline forged from years of standing at the edge of battlefields, where losing composure meant losing men. Even when the gallery erupted in small laughs, when whispers turned into open chuckles, the general remained still. He clasped his hands in front of him, the rings of service glinting faintly in the light, a reminder that those who mocked him had never carried the weight of responsibility he bore. His calm composure made their laughter feel smaller, weaker, as if the more they tried to shake him, the more foolish they appeared for failing. It wasn't arrogance that kept him steady, it was something deeper, a quiet confidence that no courtroom could take away. The calm was more than just stillness. It was deliberate, purposeful. Every controlled breath, every measured word, every steady glance was a decision. He wasn't reacting to them, he was letting them react to him. The police officer shifted in his seat, the smirk fading slightly when he realized the man before him wouldn't break. The judge paused longer than usual before speaking, as if he too recognized something unshakable in the soldier's demeanor. That calm presence began to change the energy in the room, subtle at first, but noticeable to anyone paying attention. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it carried weight, the kind of weight that only discipline and years of earned respect could hold. There was a power in that calmness that words alone couldn't describe. It was the presence of someone who had nothing to prove to the room, because his life already stood as proof. The general didn't need to shout, didn't need to argue, didn't need to demand respect. His calm demanded it on its own, and though the courtroom tried to strip it away, his composure became the very thing that silenced their arrogance, little by little, moment by moment. His calm was not just the absence of reaction, it was the presence of strength, and it was the quiet reminder that true authority never needs to beg to be recognized. Existence as a challenge to their authority. The moment the phone came out, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted in ways no one had expected. Up until then, the arrogance, the mockery, and the dismissive glances had ruled the air, but when the Black Army general calmly reached for his phone, it was as if an unseen thread of tension pulled through the room. He didn't fumble with it, didn't rush, didn't even look like a man seeking permission. He moved with the same steady discipline that had carried him through battlefields, and that deliberate calm made the gesture far more powerful than a raised voice or a slammed fist ever could. The courtroom leaned in unconsciously, every smirk flickering into a pause, every whisper dying into silence, as they realized this was no ordinary call. The officer who had been mocking him chuckled at first, assuming it was a bluff, a distraction, a desperate move by a man who had nothing else to stand on. But the general's composure didn't match desperation. His posture remained steady, his tone low, his movements precise. He dialed the number as if he already knew the outcome, as if this phone call wasn't a chance, it was a certainty. The judge, who had sat with quiet condescension, adjusted his glasses and shifted slightly forward, his face betraying a flicker of curiosity that wasn't there moments before. The gallery, which had thrived on ridicule, now hushed, every eye trained on the soldier who stood like a pillar of control in a room that thought it owned him. When the line connected, the silence deepened. The general's voice, calm and respectful, carried across the air with a tone that was unmistakably different from how he had addressed the courtroom. It wasn't the voice of a man speaking to an equal or pleading with someone for help, it was the voice of a man reporting to someone of immense authority, someone whose very name carried weight. No one on the outside could hear the words on the other end, but the way the general responded was enough to shift the mood. Each "yes, sir," or "understood" rolled out with precision, and with every one of those acknowledgments, the arrogance in the room thinned like smoke fading into air. The officer who had been smirking now shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confidence rattled not by force, but by the realization that the general's authority stretched far beyond the four walls of that courtroom. The judge's smile faltered into a stillness, the kind where authority itself begins to feel questioned, where the gavel doesn't seem as heavy as it once did. For the first time that day, the laughter stopped, not because someone demanded silence, but because silence demanded itself. The call itself didn't take long, but every second of it hung heavy in the air. Each pause between words was amplified, each moment of listening stretched into suspense. People exchanged uneasy glances, trying to piece together who was on the other end of that line. Some thought it might be a lawyer, others assumed a high-ranking officer, but those who had lived long enough in systems of power recognized something else: the weight of command doesn't tremble unless it's reporting to something higher than itself. And the general's calm demeanor confirmed it. This wasn't a man reaching out for rescue. This was a man pulling a lever that few in the room even knew existed. When he ended the call, he didn't announce anything, didn't boast, didn't even raise his voice. He simply placed the phone down with the same deliberate motion he had used to pick it up. That act alone was louder than any declaration could have been. The room didn't need him to explain what had just happened, they could feel it. The balance of power had shifted. The courtroom that once laughed now sat in quiet anticipation, waiting, wondering, and fearing what would follow. The general's silence after the call carried more authority than the judge's gavel, more weight than the officer's badge, and more strength than the whispers that had once filled the room. The call had not been loud, not dramatic, not showy. But its impact was undeniable. It was a reminder that real power does not announce itself with noise, it changes the atmosphere with certainty. And in that moment, the entire courtroom realized they had underestimated the man before them, a realization that left them with only one response: silence. The silence that followed the call was unlike anything the courtroom had ever experienced. Just moments before, the air was thick with arrogance and mockery, filled with whispers and laughter that seemed to bounce against the walls with no restraint. But now, that same air felt heavy, pressing down on every person seated there. The Black Army general had not raised his voice, had not delivered a fiery speech, had not even threatened anyone. All he had done was place a call, and somehow, that single act stripped the room of every ounce of false confidence it once carried. The silence was sharp, cutting, almost deafening in contrast to the chaos that had filled it before. The police officer, who had been the loudest in his mockery, now sat frozen in his chair. His smirk had dissolved the moment the phone call ended, and now his jaw was tight, his posture tense. His eyes darted around the room as if searching for someone to reassure him that everything was still under his control. But no reassurance came. The weight of what had just happened gnawed at him, the realization that the man he had dismissed so easily might hold authority he could never dream of touching. His badge, his uniform, his position, suddenly, they felt smaller, weaker, meaningless in the presence of someone who could silence an entire courtroom with one call. The judge was no different. He adjusted in his seat, his robe suddenly feeling heavier on his shoulders, as though the authority it once symbolized had been questioned in front of everyone. His face, which earlier carried condescension and faint amusement, now revealed something else: unease. He tried to maintain composure, to keep his voice steady when he finally spoke again, but even his words carried hesitation. For the first time in that trial, the gavel in his hand no longer felt like the most powerful instrument in the room. It was a quiet but undeniable shift. The general's calm had replaced the judge's authority, leaving the man on the bench grappling with a silence he could not control. The gallery of onlookers, who had once chuckled, whispered, and leaned forward with mocking curiosity, now sat in stiff stillness. No one dared to whisper, no one dared to laugh. Their faces, once animated with ridicule, were blank with shock, some pale, some tight-lipped, all caught in the same realization. They had underestimated him. They had thought him powerless, assumed his uniform was nothing more than fabric, and dismissed his medals as tokens that carried no weight here. But the silence told them otherwise. The silence told them that this man's authority reached further than their imagination, that his influence was not something they could laugh away. Fear began to creep into the corners of the room. It wasn't the kind of fear born from immediate danger, but a deeper, more unsettling fear, the fear of being wrong, the fear of having mocked someone who held real power, the fear of consequences they couldn't see yet but knew were coming. The officer shifted again, clearing his throat, but the sound only echoed uncomfortably in the silence, drawing more attention to his unease. The judge tapped the edge of his bench, a small attempt to restore order, but even that action felt hollow. The general didn't need to say anything. The silence itself was the order. What struck everyone most was that the general did not gloat. He didn't smirk back, didn't return the humiliation, didn't even acknowledge their shift in behavior. He stood exactly as he had before, calm, composed, unshaken. And that was what made the silence more powerful. It wasn't forced, it wasn't demanded. It was earned, commanded without effort, created by the weight of who he was and the truth of what that phone call represented. That quietness became a mirror, reflecting everyone's arrogance back at them, forcing them to confront the foolishness of their laughter and the hollowness of their ridicule. The silence stretched long, long enough to make every second feel heavier than the last. Long enough for the officers to question their mockery, for the judge to question his demeanor, for the spectators to wonder what consequences were now set in motion. It was the kind of silence that no one wanted to break because breaking it meant admitting weakness, and yet holding it meant acknowledging power. The general stood as he had always stood, calm, steady, unshaken, while the courtroom wrestled with the fear that their arrogance had awakened something far greater than they could handle. All throughout the trial, the truth was hiding in plain sight, though no one in the courtroom wanted to see it. The Black Army general did not need to prove himself to the smirking officers, the dismissive judge, or the whispering crowd. His authority wasn't something he had to pull from thin air in that moment, it was something he had carried into the room from the second he walked through those doors. Every medal on his chest, every crease in his uniform, every steady breath he took was a silent reminder of decades of service, of battles fought and survived, of loyalty to a country that now dared to question his worth. The respect he commanded was not new, not borrowed, not demanded. It had been built over years of sacrifice, forged in the crucible of war, and solidified by leadership that had saved lives when others would have fallen. The officers, blinded by prejudice, couldn't see it at first. They looked only at the color of his skin, not at the history carved into his posture. They mocked the man standing before them, failing to realize that the same man had once commanded soldiers who would follow him into fire without hesitation. They didn't understand that his silence wasn't submission, it was discipline. They didn't grasp that his calm wasn't emptiness, it was control. They saw only a defendant, but what they missed was the presence of someone whose authority stretched far beyond the limits of their small courtroom. The judge, too, had dismissed him. From the bench, cloaked in the illusion of absolute power, he believed the general was just another case file, another man to be handled with routine authority. But even he felt it shift as the moments passed. The phone call had only confirmed what was already there, that this man's influence reached beyond the walls of that courtroom. The general didn't need to announce his rank or boast about his connections. His demeanor said everything. His silence after the call wasn't hesitation, it was mastery, the kind of mastery that comes from a man who knows the weight he carries, and doesn't need to wave it around for others to feel it. The gallery, once filled with murmurs of laughter, found themselves staring at a man they had misjudged from the beginning. They came expecting a spectacle, expecting to see a soldier reduced to nothing under the authority of the system. What they witnessed instead was the revelation of true power. They realized too late that they had been mocking not just a man, but a symbol, a leader whose respect had been earned long before any of them had gathered there. The authority he carried wasn't written in law books or tied to the gavel. It was written in the lives he had touched, the men he had led, the battles he had endured. The fear that crept into the room was born from that revelation. It wasn't the phone call alone that silenced them, it was the realization that the general had been holding back from the very beginning. He had walked in with the respect of nations behind him, the recognition of leaders, and the loyalty of soldiers who would answer his call without question. Yet he never flaunted it, never shoved it into their faces. He stood calm, allowing them to show their arrogance, their mockery, their dismissal. And when the time came, all it took was one simple act to remind them of the truth, that he was never beneath them, he was above, standing quietly, carrying a weight they could never match. The authority he carried was not visible to those blinded by arrogance, but when the silence took hold, it became undeniable. They could feel it in the pit of their stomachs, sense it in the way the room had shifted, taste it in the fear that now clung to the air. The respect he commanded wasn't something that could be taken away by laughter or diminished by a smirk. It was the kind of respect that endures, the kind that silences crowds, the kind that reveals itself not through noise but through quiet, unshakable certainty. And as he stood there, calm as ever, the entire courtroom realized that the authority they thought belonged to them had, in fact, been in his hands all along.